If you picture a flock of flamingos in your mind's eye right now, you are probably seeing this vibrant, almost neon pink, right?
Absolutely. It's totally iconic.
Yeah, it's their defining characteristic. But if you travel to this one specific geographic coordinate in Egypt's Fayum Depression, a body of water called Lake Qarun, and you look at the famous flamingos waiting near the shore there, you are going to see a completely different bird.
Yeah, it's quite a shock the first time you see it.
It really is. I mean, they are losing that iconic color. They are turning into these washed out, ghostly, kind of pale white shadows of themselves. And so today, we are taking a custom-tailored deep dive into the hidden dramatic history of this single lake just for you.
Right, and to do that, we're pulling from some really diverse sources.
Exactly. We are synthesizing biological field data, a century of ecological tracking, and even archaeological records to solve this massive environmental puzzle.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for a long time, the prevailing narrative about these fading flamingos was actually a complete myth. Yeah, it was a very persistent myth, too. Like, the story circulating among casual observers was that the environment at Lake Qarun had simply become too harsh.
Yeah.
And that this was forcing the flamingos into a sort of biological triage.
Like they were making a choice or something.
Right, exactly. The assumption was that the birds were making an active physiological decision to stop producing pink feathers, basically routing all their metabolic energy purely into survival.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it paints a very dramatic picture of an animal fighting to stay alive. But from a biological standpoint, the mechanism of feather coloration just doesn't work like a discretionary budget that you can cut.
Which makes perfect sense when you really think about it, because a bird isn't sitting there with a ledger, balancing its energy expenses.
No, not at all.
Feather color for flamingos is strictly dictated by diet. I mean, they don't actually synthesize that pink pigment themselves. They have to eat it.
Yes, exactly. It's completely dependent on their intake.
And they have those incredibly specialized beaks, right? Like they flip their heads upside down in the water, and they use these microscopic comb-like structures. I think they're called lamellae.
Yep, lamellae.
Right, to filter out the mud and water, trapping algae, diatoms, and tiny crustaceans. And those specific microscopic organisms are just packed with carotenoids.
Yeah, and carotenoids are the crucial mechanism here. They're the same natural organic pigments that make carrots orange or tomatoes red.
Oh, right, of course.
So when a flamingo ingests these carotenoid-rich organisms, enzymes in their liver break down the pigments. And then the pigments bind to fats, travel through the bloodstream, and are eventually deposited into the growing feather follicles.
So it's a very direct pipeline from the food to the feather.
Exactly. If the diet lacks carotenoids, the liver has nothing to process. The feathers simply grow in without the pigment.
I mean, it's essentially like a color printer running out of magenta ink.
That's a really great way to put it.
Right. The printer doesn't make a conscious, energy-saving choice to stop printing in color. It literally just lacks the physical ink. The flamingo keeps molting, it keeps printing new feathers out of keratin, but without the carotenoid ink from the base of their food chain, the feathers just emerge totally pale.
Exactly. The mechanics of it are entirely passive on the bird's part. Now, the biological data does indicate that global migration stress is an aggravating factor here.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, as wetlands shrink globally, these flamingos are forced to fly much longer distances without reliable stopover points to refuel. So they are arriving at Lake Qarun already exhausted and nutrient depleted.
Okay, that makes sense.
But that is only a fraction of the story. What's fascinating here is that the primary mechanism driving this widespread color loss is that these specific carotenoid-rich organisms they need have largely vanished from the lake itself.
Wow, so the food is just gone.
Basically, yeah. The flamingos are still running their filter feeding systems, they're still consuming calories, but the nutritional profile of the water has fundamentally changed beneath their feet.
Which means to solve the mystery of the fading feathers, we have to look away from the bird entirely and look directly at the water chemistry.
Exactly. We have to look at the lake.
And looking at the ecological tracking data over the last century from our sources, the hydrology of this lake is honestly staggering, because Lake Qarun is a closed inland basin sitting right in the middle of the Egyptian desert. Yet somehow, the very base of its food chain has been completely rewired.
Yeah, and the sheer physics of the lake's hydrology dictate everything about its ecosystem. A closed basin means that water flows into the depression, but there is no geographic outlet.
Right, stuck there.
Stuck.
Right.
The water has nowhere to go but up, through evaporation. And if we look at the historical measurements, back in 1906, the lake's salinity was roughly 11 parts per thousand. That is brackish. Definitely not pure drinking water, but relatively mild. But fast forward to the 1980s, and the salinity had skyrocketed to nearly 38 parts per thousand.
That's a monumental jump. I mean, for context, 38 parts per thousand is actually saltier than the open ocean.
It is. It's incredibly high.
So, how does an inland desert lake triple its salt content in a single human lifetime?
It comes down to agricultural expansion colliding with desert thermodynamics.
Okay, thermodynamics.
Right. Since the early 1800s, Lake Qarun has been utilized as the primary endpoint for agricultural drainage water from the surrounding Fayum farmland. When farmers irrigate their crops, the water picks up trace amounts of dissolved salts and minerals from the soil.
And then all that runoff just flows straight down into the lake.
Exactly. That agricultural runoff flows down into the basin. But because it's a closed basin in an incredibly arid climate, the intense desert heat evaporates the surface water at a staggering rate. We're talking up to 7 millimeters per hour during the peak of summer.
So the pure H2O turns into vapor and leaves the system, but the heavy dissolved salts get left behind.
Precisely.
It's essentially a giant slow-motion evaporation pan that's just constantly being refilled with trace minerals.
The concentration of salt is cumulative and relentless. And, as you can imagine, this rising salinity created a lethal environment for the native microscopic life.
Right, they just couldn't adapt fast enough.
No, they couldn't. The historical fossil records found in the lake's sediment layers reveal an ecological flip that should be impossible. A century ago, 83% of the phytoplankton, the microscopic plants at the base of the food web, were freshwater or low salinity species.
Okay, 83%.
All right. Today, 52% of the phytoplankton in this desert lake are marine species.
Wait, hang on. I need to pause on that because that defies basic geography.
It sounds crazy, I know.
Even if a lake becomes as salty as the ocean, it's still hundreds of miles away from the actual Mediterranean Sea. Ocean algae don't just spontaneously generate in a desert basin, no matter how salty it gets.
You are absolutely right to catch that. They don't teleport.
Right. So how did they get there?
The arrival of those marine species is the result of a very specific, well-intentioned human intervention that inadvertently triggered this massive ecological cascade.
Oh no, it's always human intervention, isn't it?
Usually, yeah. In the mid-1920s, the Egyptian Ministry of Agriculture observed the rising salinity and realized the native freshwater fish species were beginning to die off.
It's because it was getting too salty for them.
Exactly. And the local fishing economy was facing total collapse. So to save the industry, they made this bold decision to physically capture marine fish from the Mediterranean. Species like mullet, sole, and shrimp.
Okay.
They loaded them into tanks, transported them across the desert, and released them directly into Lake Qarun.
Wait, they just transplanted an ocean ecosystem into a lake.
They really did.
But I'm guessing they didn't, filter the water those Mediterranean fish were transported in?
Not at all. The transport water, the digestive tracts of the fish, the mud on the netting, all of it was teeming with microscopic marine life. Without realizing it, the ministry introduced highly aggressive marine algae, specifically species like Polysiphonia utricularis.
And because the native freshwater algae were already dying off from the extreme osmotic stress of the rising salt, this new Mediterranean invader basically walked into an empty room.
It was a blank canvas with optimal conditions for them. Polysiphonia utricularis has an incredibly high tolerance for hypersaline environments. It found itself in warm, nutrient-rich water with absolutely zero native predators adapted to consume it.
Wow. So it just took over.
Completely. It aggressively outcompeted the struggling native diatoms and fundamentally re-engineered the entire microscopic architecture of the lake.
What's fascinating here is how directly this invisible microscopic shift echoes all the way up the food chain to alter the physical appearance of a massive bird.
Exactly. It's a direct line.
The 1920s attempt to save the fishing industry is the exact mechanism causing today's flamingos to print out white feathers. The new marine-dominated food web simply doesn't synthesize the specific carotenoid profile the flamingos evolved to consume.
Right.
So the fading bird is just a visible billboard advertising the invisible collapse beneath the surface.
It is a textbook example of unintended environmental consequences. The ecosystem has entirely shifted its identity in just 100 years.
Which makes you wonder, If this basin has transformed so radically just since the 1920s, what was it like thousands of years ago? Before the agricultural runoff and the massive salt accumulation.
It was a completely different world.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because our sources on the archaeological data pull us roughly 7,000 years into the past. And it entirely shatters the modern image of the arid Fayum Desert.
It really does. The data comes from comprehensive excavations of two Neolithic human settlements known as Qam K and Qam W. And these date back to between 4850 and 4250 BC. To understand this era, you really have to completely reimagine the hydrology. Back then, this wasn't the shrinking hypersaline Lake Qarun we see today.
What was it?
It was an absolutely massive, sprawling body of fresh water known to geologists as Lake Morris. And crucially, it wasn't a closed basin yet. It was connected directly to the Nile River system.
Oh, wow. Which means it wasn't a stagnant evaporation pan. It had flowing water, and it flooded annually alongside the Nile.
Yes, exactly.
And the human settlements clustered around its shores weren't just temporary hunter-gatherer camps either. The archaeologists sifted through over 200,000 animal bone fragments from their ancient trash middens.
Yeah, the scale of the excavation is incredible.
Right. And the breakdown of those bones reveals a highly sophisticated level of agriculture. We are talking about evidence of early domesticated livestock dating back to around 5400 BC.
The animal remains provide such a high-resolution snapshot of the surrounding landscape back then. The researchers identified bones from domestic dogs, early cattle, pigs, goats, and most notably, sheep.
Right, sheep.
And the ratio between those animals is a vital environmental indicator. In the archaeological record of this site, sheep bones heavily dominate over goat bones.
And if you understand livestock biology, that ratio tells you everything about the ancient vegetation. Because goats are notorious browsers. They can survive on incredibly marginal land, eating tough woody scrub, bark, and weeds.
They'll eat almost anything.
Exactly. But sheep are grazers. They require soft, high-quality green pasture to thrive. You don't herd massive flocks of sheep in a dry, sandy desert. So the dominance of sheep proves that the shores of Lake Morris were a veritable green oasis.
It was an exceptionally lush environment that supported significant multi-generational agricultural efforts. The Neolithic people inhabiting Qam K and Qam W possessed the technology and the environment to maintain large, mobile herds of protein.
Right.
Yet if we connect this to the bigger picture, the data presents a massive behavioral anomaly. When the archaeologists quantified the total dietary intake of these settlements based on the bone middens, they discovered something crazy.
What was it?
Despite having thriving herds of domesticated cattle and sheep, up to 99% of the animal remains at the sites were fish.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on this. Because the caloric math doesn't seem to add up there.
I know, it sounds counterintuitive.
Right. Because if you are an early human, the domestication of large mammals is a huge technological leap because it provides a walking pantry. Cattle and sheep give you mobile access to meat, milk, and hides.
Yep, they're highly valuable assets.
You can follow the weather, you can evade drought. Why on earth would you spend the generational effort to domesticate sheep, only to turn around and rely almost entirely on fish for your survival? Like, why ignore your walking pantry?
Because the specific mechanics of the ancient lake provided an energy yield that made traditional herding or hunting look incredibly inefficient. It goes back to the lake's connection to the Nile.
Oh, the flooding.
Exactly. During the late summer, typically around August and September, the Nile would swell with floodwaters, causing Lake Morris to overflow its banks. This created vast, temporary stretches of very warm, highly oxygenated, shallow water along the shoreline.
And shallow, warm water is exactly what triggers spawning behavior in fish.
Precisely. It was the annual breeding ground for colossal fish. The archaeozoological analysis of the vertebrae found in those trash heaps shows they were harvesting massive claried catfish that averaged 60 centimeters in length.
Wait, 60 centimeters? That is a 2-foot-long, incredibly dense source of protein.
Huge fish. They were also harvesting tilapia, averaging 30 centimeters. Millions of these large fish would migrate from the deeper waters into the shallow, flooded margins to breed.
And from a behavioral standpoint, when fish are actively spawning in water that is maybe only ankle or knee deep, their survival instincts essentially shut down. They are thrashing around, totally single-minded, and highly visible.
Oh, they are completely distracted by reproduction. The researchers note that under these specific biological conditions, the local humans wouldn't even need sophisticated hooks or deep water nets.
They could just grab them.
Yeah. You could wade into the shallows and effectively catch these 2-foot catfish by hand or trap them in basic tidal pools as the floodwaters slightly receded. It was the ultimate low-risk, high-yield caloric investment.
That's amazing.
You have a massive, entirely predictable biological event, delivering tons of easy-to-harvest protein straight to your shoreline every single year.
And the predictability is the key there, isn't it? Why exert the immense caloric energy required to hunt wild game or constantly move cattle across a landscape when the lake practically hands you a feast on a scheduled timetable?
Exactly, it changes everything.
And the sheer abundance of the catfish harvest fundamentally altered their behavioral evolution. The lake's biology gave them permission to stop wandering, and the bone record actually provides definitive proof that these people were completely tethered to the shoreline.
Yes, and we find that proof in the presence of the pig bones at the sites.
Because pigs are the ultimate anchor. I mean, they are completely incompatible with a nomadic lifestyle.
From a physiological standpoint, pigs are poorly adapted to arid travel. Unlike sheep or cattle, pigs do not sweat effectively, meaning they require constant access to water and shade to thermoregulate.
Right, they overheat easily.
They also have a monogastric digestive system, which is actually similar to humans. This means they cannot digest the tough, fibrous grasses found in deep desert pastures. You simply cannot drive a herd of pigs on a long trek across an arid landscape.
So if you find evidence of humans raising pigs, you have undeniable proof that those humans were not moving.
Exactly.
The predictable seasonal flying and the massive spawning of the claried catfish allowed these Neolithic humans to drop an anchor, build permanent settlements, and invest in stationary livestock. The hydrology of the lake literally dictated the sociology and settlement patterns of human civilization in the Fayum.
It really demonstrates that early human innovation wasn't just about conquering nature. It was about intimately understanding and aligning with the precise biological rhythms of a specific microenvironment.
So what does this all mean? When we zoom out and look at the lifeblood of this single geographic coordinate across millennia, a profound narrative emerges.
A really remarkable one.
We started in a massive, sprawling freshwater haven where the predictable shallow water spawning of giant catfish provided such a reliable caloric surplus that Neolithic humans could stop wandering, settle down, and build communities around pig farming.
Right.
Then we watched that exact same geographic basin slowly sever its connection to the Nile and concentrate with trace salts from agricultural runoff over thousands of years. We saw well-meaning humans in the 1920s attempt to fix the dying ecosystem by dumping Mediterranean ocean life into the desert, inadvertently handing the microscopic food web over to an aggressive hypersaline algae.
Yeah, that cascade of events is just wild.
And today, we see the ultimate visible consequence of that century-long chain reaction. An ecosystem where the altered water chemistry is quietly depriving the flamingos of their carotenoids, literally draining the pink right out of their feathers.
And the overarching lesson here is the absolute interconnectedness of a localized environment. We have a tendency to look at the natural world in isolated fragments, you know?
Right, like we only see one piece at a time.
Exactly. We observe the fading color of a bird, or the salt crust on a farmer's field, or the archaeological bones of a fish. But this deep dive illustrates that a subtle, invisible shift in microscopic water chemistry does not stay isolated. It reverberates.
It echoes through everything.
It dictates the dominant algae, which starves the crustaceans, which ultimately strips the pigment from a flamingo's plumage. And on a larger scale, the mechanics of a summer flood dictate the behavioral evolution of human agriculture. The environment is the active author of both animal physiology and human history.
It really shifts your entire perspective on how delicate the mechanics of our world really are. The biggest, most profound changes are almost always hidden in the smallest microscopic details, often long before we can see the physical results.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a final, lingering question for you to ponder. If the deep, complex history of an entire ecosystem's collapse and transformation can be read in the fading, pale feathers of a single wading bird, what subtle visual markers in your own immediate environment are quietly signaling massive, invisible ecological shifts right now?